Hello and welcome back to another episode of Beyond the To-Do List. I'm your host, Erik Fisher, and this is the show where I talk to the people behind the productivity. This week I'm excited to share with you a conversation I had with Greg Audino, and in this conversation we get into the topic of control. We talk about what control is, how much control we actually have. Do we have no control? Do we have full control? Is it somewhere in between? How we can deal with that, how we can have agency over our lives, and what effect that has psychologically, emotionally, mentally. And it seems like a pretty fitting episode for the year 2020 in terms of how much control do you have when seemingly things are out of control. And listening back through this conversation myself, I found it clarifying and calming, and I hope that it does the same for you. So I'll get out of the way and just say, enjoy this conversation with Greg Audino. Well, this week it is my privilege to welcome to the show Greg Audino. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Erik. Very excited to be here.
Some people may see your picture and may recognize you visually from things you've acted in, but now you're doing self-help and productivity falls right in there. You know, all those categories that everybody talks about, you know, self-help, time management, productivity, health and wellness, you know, all of those fall together. So how did you move from one to the other / are you still acting?
Oh man. So that's a big question there. I am still doing some acting. It's sort of been put on the back burner as I've just started to find more fulfillment in this. But yeah, I still have a few more offers to do, so I'll go back to LA to do them when the time is right, and we'll see what happens after that. But at the moment, I am putting a lot more time towards my self-development work. The transition was a really interesting one. I think it was like there were really a few steps that sort of led to it. I do think in a way the seed had been planted when I was younger. Like before I wanted to be an actor, I wanted to be a marriage counselor. And then I ended up becoming an actor. That was my full-time job for, right out of college. Within the last couple of years, though, it has been a sort of a transition into self-help. I was doing them both at the same time. And I think it started back in 2014. I was going through a really difficult breakup. And I recall at the time, I was really having a difficult time recovering. And I recall in that time frame, I just had I started to appreciate the value of having somebody that would listen to me. I was contacting people for help that I knew I could count on, but I think I just reached a point where I felt like I was like a pest or like I'd overstayed my welcome. Like, they don't really want to hear this. So at the time, I just felt like I had nowhere to turn. And I just, I started to, I just wished I had somebody that I knew would listen to me unconditionally. And realistically, those people were out there, but me feeling like a burden was kind of my own limitation. But I got an idea of what value came from something like that kind of role. Meanwhile, my as time had gone on too, I've always sort of questioned everything I'm doing and been very reflective on everything. And I think that with acting, it was taking up so much of my time. But realistically, I wasn't really helping anybody else. Everything I was doing with acting was really just to serve me. It was never about anybody else. And I sort of took issue with that just because I'm a very fortunate person. I just have a lot of blessings in life. So I think, not to sound too preachy, but it just it sort of felt like I was taking too much from the universe, if you will, to kind of just be receiving everything that life had to offer as opposed to giving anything back. So I was just, again, seeking a role where I could be of assistance to people a little bit more over time. And then the election happened in 2016. This is a long story. I'm sorry. I'm still 3 years back. The election happened in 2016. And, anytime the election, there's an election, there's just all of these real issues in the world come to light. There's so much discussion about actual problems the world is facing at the deepest level. And those kinds of things, they just always bring back perspective to me, just this thought that there are people that are truly struggling out there that really need help. And I felt like, the same was the case for me, obviously not on the same scale of people that are like suffering in real ways, but like, on the outside, I was just like a happy guy, and I knew that I was having my troubles, let alone people who are suffering, like from hunger or like famine or war-torn countries. But I was just sort of reintroduced to like how much pain there truly is, and how many scales it exists on, and how many people could be helped in one way or another. And then I think the final straw was the day after my 26th birthday party. It was a Sunday morning. I was completely hungover, and I was browsing through Netflix like you do. And I stumbled upon the Tony Robbins documentary, I Am Not Your Guru. And I just found the documentary to be extremely touching. I think a lot of people sort of have like these mixed opinions about Tony Robbins these days, but however you think about him, just the documentary is really powerful. And there are so many people that really believe in him, and he just touches so many lives. And I just found it very special to see how many, to just see how much like service this man seems to do in his life. So I don't know if that was English, but you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the final straw. And then a few months later, I enrolled in a life coaching course, and I got my certification. And yeah, that was that. The site was built. So yeah, on my website, I create a lot of videos. So it's sort of, and they're taking life's common problems and offering new solutions to them. And so it's sort of it's a combination of my passions, if you will, because it's all on camera stuff. So I'm writing and filming and editing and acting in it and acting. So yeah, it's been an interesting evolution, but I'm pretty sure that is how it happened.
The topic of today's conversation, I think, directly connects to some of the, moving away from the acting, as well as, and again, going back to it a little bit, but also into the different role is, obviously you want to make some positive change in the world, but at the same time, how much change, how much change is possible? How much change are we individually able to do? And, again, the theme of the conversation here is control. As far as control goes, we've never officially talked about that topic on this show before. We've touched on it. We've danced around it. We've talked about, ownership and responsibility, but those things are maybe a little bit different than what control is. So like, what's your definition of the word control? And what do you generally believe people in general believe about control?
Yeah. Well, we tend to believe that it's a good thing, obviously. I mean, no one ever doesn't want to have control of some kind, even if it's like control that comes with the release of control, which, is only something that's really talked about by like spiritual leaders. So the belief is that we're in trouble if we don't have it. The less control we have, the more risk there is. And though we might not believe it, we act as though we have more than we actually do. The lack of control we actually do have tends to be one of those things that we realize the truth about when things are calm. But, in the eye of the storm of activities, we just press on as if we do have control. And the more we behave in that way, the more normal it feels. So obviously, yeah, I mean, control is something we're constantly trying to maintain. But I do think that this desire for it, the desire for it is natural, but this constant like pursuit of it and what it can kind of do to us is where we run into problems, I think.
Now, there's different definitions of this. Like one that I think of when I hear the word control is self-control, which is, controlling yourself. And, how much do you believe controlling ourselves is possible, I guess?
It's just it really depends, it really depends on so many things. I mean, first, like on the surface, like, this idea of willpower that people try to enforce is like, it's good and it's admirable, but like realistically, your willpower is a lot weaker than having an environment that supports what you want to do. For example, you know what I mean? If you want to stop drinking soda, you are much more likely to just not have soda in your house than if you were to just like, stare at soda every day and just say like, I'm not going to drink it. I'm not going to do it. Just the environment will help you a lot more than like your willpower will. So I don't know. I mean,
well, and that's an area right there where, for example, to create that environment would necessitate having some ability to control what is or isn't in that environment.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a very layered question. So, I mean, in that scenario, you could say that just like having the desire to change or the desire to control something is like a form of control in the first place, because you're taking the step to alter your environment. So it's an extremely layered thing. But I mean, self-control exists to extremely different degrees in different people. And I mean, a lot of it, of course, is based on our histories and our tendencies and our reactions to things based on our histories and experiences. But unfortunately, genetics also play a humongous part of our levels of self-control, even our values, beliefs, ability to work hard and stuff. Like a lot of these things are defined by genetics too. Which only adds to this, this lack of control that I'm sort of alluding to here. So in a way, it's sort of a lottery. Obviously, people can train themselves to have all kinds of feelings in life. Control would be one of them. Certain, a degree of self-control. But ultimately, it's my belief that the result of it, the amount of control that you actually can have, is different for everybody based on, a million different variables.
What are some of the ways that, as you've looked at this topic, you've seen people try to, with varying degrees of success, assert control?
Yeah, well, every decision we make really is an effort for control, and you can't blame us because it's a survival technique. So like there's control over ourselves for one. There's getting the right job, house, whatever, and creating plans around them. Those are common examples of exterior control. Interior control, if you will, is also all over the place as we try to develop certain reactions to things, maybe in spite of what our bodies and minds are telling us. Like people with excessive anxiety or people who are prone to panic attacks, anyone with trauma really tend to be, I don't want to say guilty of this, but it's easy for these kinds of people to disallow feelings and try to force certain feelings out and fight them without realizing that they're there for a reason. So there's that, there's control over reactions to things for sure. There's control over others, manipulation tactics, using money, using power. And, power is the real word to emphasize here. Control is about power. It's about creating a powerful enough base that other things don't shake us.
Yeah, so it's about having some sense of control, some kind of asserting of our will over our interior circumstances, our interior, the life of our mind, as well as our environment and those that we interact in that environment with.
Yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, the control we try to keep over our minds, that interior control I mentioned, is sort of where we double our problems up because, a lot of people they don't want to feel bad about feeling bad, but they do. If, again, somebody who has anxiety, for example, is, very likely to just get frustrated after a while and say, like, this needs to stop. This is ruining my life. Here it comes again. I can't believe I have this anxiety. And all of a sudden, like this pain is doubled because you're now not only fighting with the object of your anxiety, but you're fighting with the fact that you have anxiety itself. And it's, so this, the more control we try to seek, the more trouble we can often get ourselves into.
How do you see people trying to assert control? It almost seems like it's a default action where people try to assert control without even realizing it.
Definitely. I guess that would depend on the consciousness with which we make decisions. The more self-aware you are, I guess, the more control you would have. Most of the times that otherwise good people elicit bad reactions from others with their behavior, it's because they've tried to maintain control in a way that they didn't realize was harmful. examples would be like, not giving loved ones enough breathing space or making people's decisions for them based on how your own experiences would have worked. So I would say that most of the time that we get an unexpected negative outcome to something we've done with good intentions are times when we've tried to assert control in a way that, if not completely unrealized, was close to it because of the fact that it was probably assessed poorly.
But ultimately here, I mean, do you think that trying to assert any control, or is it trying to assert too much control? What is the problem here? In other words, because I personally, I'm still trying to grapple with this, obviously, and that's why this discussion is interesting to me. Like, I'm always growing up with this idea of, I'm always moving forward with this idea that I have certain responsibilities. I have certain ownership of roles in my life, and making decisions is owning that. In other words, me having control over it. But that's different, I think, than maybe what we're talking about, or is it?
It depends on how you define control. Like you can, if you're taking certain ownership, certain actions, making certain decisions, obviously there is a sense of control in that. I mean, not only obviously just the freedom that you have to make those decisions is great in the first place, but in terms of the outcomes, I think that, the control that I'm talking about is really just this idea of that there are so many variables that can affect or completely override what decisions we do make. So, control, like anything, really just comes down to how we define it. But I think the way that people struggle with it, and the way that like I'm talking about, is this idea that like we can make our lives what we want them to be. But realistically, that's impossible, because there are so many things that will happen to us. Again, the decisions we make, the steps we take, like you're talking about, are super useful. They can help. They can create great successes. Obviously, people have a lot of what we have is due to what, efforts we've put out. But a lot of what we have also is due to completely, things that happen completely by chance. And it is funny that a lot of people when reflecting on how their lives went or are going, a lot of the greatest things are things that happened completely by accident, for better or worse. So I think that, yes, there is definitely some control that we have in the fact that we are able to steer our decisions, within reason. But there are also so many things that will affect the way we make those decisions. So it's an impossibly deep question to really get to the bottom of.
Sure. Well, it's interesting that you say the word steer, because as you were talking, it kind of hit me. I feel like this is maybe a good metaphor to describe what we're talking about here, or the differences between them. Whereas, so for example, steering, I'm in a car and I have my hands on the wheel and I'm moving down the road, and people would say I am in control of the car. But I think that's a flawed way of thinking about that. Instead, I am influencing the direction of the car. I'm influencing the way the car goes and speed and all of that. But there are so many other things outside my control, whether it comes to icy roads or rain or other drivers that I cannot control, that will affect the way that the car, moves through the world. And so I can influence, I can choose, I can influence, but in the end, it's still not totally up to me the way the car behaves. Is that does that jive with what you're thinking?
Unquestionably. That is a really good example. Yes. And, the way that people get all angry in traffic, it's like an extra applicable example for my money. It's a great example. People are, you think about any time you're driving, yes, there's a million different things that can happen to you. Like you said, not to mention the car itself having an issue. But, still people will try to God, I have to make it there in 10 minutes. I'm going to go fast. I'm going to work around all these obstacles to get to where I want to go. And whether or not they make it there is up to a lot of things. And a lot of times they will make it there. But there might be times when they won't, whether they arrive late or whether they don't arrive at all. So, yes, the car example was a very good analogy. Good work, Erik.
So looking through that lens, then I can see the perspective of people who, maybe they're not thinking of it this way about their life or other people's lives, the way that I was just describing. They're thinking of it maybe more in terms of, I get in the car and now the car is me. It's an extension of me and I am in complete control. And no matter what's out there, like I can bowl people over, I can go through things but they treat it that way as if they themselves are that way, like in life, like they are demanding, in other words, they are asserting dominance and control no matter what, which we're not saying be weak-willed. We're not saying don't, have desires, but I think what we're saying is that asserting control is sometimes a futile or a flawed idea or process or idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there are simply too many variables that we can't conceive of, let alone the ones that we can conceive of, because there are too many moving pieces in our outer worlds, and since our outer world is constantly altering who we are, our inner worlds are as well. All people change, including ourselves. So this classic belief of having control, which again tends to pertain more to our environment itself rather than how we look at it, is never going to succeed in a long-lasting manner. And I'd argue that the longer control does succeed, so again, like the more times you get to your destination in 10 minutes after bowling people over, the longer we feel we are in control, we simultaneously start to lose a sense of control because of how much there is to lose. It takes more and more upkeep to maintain things, which is stressful, and we can become weaker and weaker in the face of this adversity, and we kind of become like a house of cards, just trying to maintain the control that we've established in the past. So again, it's this: if we get attached to the things that we end up having control over, which is easy to do when we start to believe or have more faith in the fact that we do indeed have control over them. When we get attached to that and those things are kind of, we rely on them, that's when we have a problem.
This makes me think of, and I'm sure you've heard of this, it's like a really trite kind of a like serenity prayer, right? Where it's like, I'm trying to think of it off the top of my head. It's, God grant me the serenity to, you've heard this, right? I'm trying to come up with it off the top of my head, but it's like, help me know the things I can't change and the things that I can, and then the wisdom to know the difference between those two. Yeah.
I know what you're saying. Yeah.
It makes me think, this all makes me think of that. In other words, and there are, and so I guess that's the way I'm walking through this is, again, I used the word influence earlier. We have certain amounts of influence. It varies from thing to thing and, in percentages and degrees of how much. But I think like what you were saying, we get attached to thinking we have 100% influence or control over things. And then it's really then when the outcomes don't line up that we have issues.
Exactly. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Because all of a sudden the control that we thought we had is in question. And, it sort of depends on the person, as to where they go from there. Do they see this and do they start to allow a lack of control and be accepting of these things, which is a healthier response? Or do they say, no, everything else is flawed, and because I always have control, I still have control right now, and things need to continue to morph around to, apply to or to work alongside how I want them to be, rather than am I the one that needs to make change, and am I the one that needs to assimilate to this lack of control that sort of presented itself. So yeah, it's the, once people arrive at an outcome that is not what they desired, the way they interpret that can completely alter their relationship with control, at least within that lens over time. And, it sort of goes back to what I just said a moment ago about how there's like this idea of control that exists within our environment. Like, if the environment is what we set it to be, then I'm in control, versus this idea of like, mindset around control, and if I'm in control, it's because I'm allowing things to, I'm allowing things to happen. So I have a healthy mindset over control again, and I'm willing to assimilate versus no, if the environment is right, then it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong, and it needs to become right. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Well, and that actually makes me think of, like, we've got a couple of different choices, I guess, in our perspective when it comes to this. Like, there's obviously, and I'm going to save this one for last. There's what's the healthy way to assert control. But prior to that, there's, I think, two unhealthy ways to go about it. One is to think we have no control at all.
Yeah.
And then the other is to think we have control over everything. And so why are those first two choices flawed choices?
So thinking we have complete control is obviously a problem because we just don't. Unless we're willing to, obviously maybe we think we have complete control at some points, and when the truth reveals itself, if we're able to again respond to that in kind and then adjust into again maybe healthy ways to assert control, that's a good thing. But if if we think we have complete control, obviously it's a problem because that can lead to lack of empathy. Maybe, it can lead to, again, lack of flexibility, which is probably the biggest problem. So yeah, we obviously don't want to think we have complete control because then everything in our life, everything is a pawn in our life. You know what I mean? And we sort of create this level of unhealthy narcissism. So we obviously don't want to have too much control. That's a problem. It leads to extreme amounts of expectation, which is like probably the biggest villain in all of our lives, is like too much expectation. So yeah, getting attached to those expectations and having them not come true it's kind of the source of all pain. Then if we think we have no control, you could spin a healthy idea on this. I mean, this like ultimate, this ultimate surrender and constant willingness to ride the wave of life is a nice thing. At the same time, though, yeah, if you think you have no control, then why ever do anything?
Yeah, that's why ever inactive or passive? You never decide to do anything, and that's a slippery slope to go down that direction for sure.
It absolutely is. And it's just like you said earlier in the conversation about the beliefs and the decisions and the ownership that you can take in any given matter. So those things are great. Obviously, yeah, if we don't think we have any control, there's no belief in anything. And if there's no belief and no hope, then you kind of have a problem. One of the like hidden causes of depression is like this lack of a secure future, so if you think back to like it's kind of clear, like if something really good happens in your outer world, if you get a new job or something, all of a sudden there's hope for the future, then you're excited. It's when the future is constantly uncertain that we start to have that there's more questions, more dark questions kind of lurking around in our minds. And that can happen if you feel you have no control over everything, because it's like, what happens in my future? Where does my future lie? Like, can I do anything and not, without any autonomy? Like, we need autonomy as well. We need progress. Like, so it kind of depends on how you interpret it. Again, like the spiritual leaders I alluded to earlier in the conversation, I think enjoy this like type of surrender if they're able to like really live presently. But I can't even speak to that because I can't do it. But for the other 99.9999% of us, this idea of having no control whatsoever is no good. Actually, I take that back, because the spiritual leaders, I think they feel a sense of control over their minds. You know what I mean? They feel a sense of peace with the fact that they don't have control, so they're able to control their thoughts about lack of control. So there's always
great observation there. I hadn't thought about that, but that definitely rings true. and honestly, that's one of the few things I think then we kind of can control is ourselves when it, and I'm not saying this is easy by any means. And none of actually any of the things that we can control usually involves it being an easy ability to control, but
Oh yeah.
just the whole it's almost it's almost an oxymoron, although there's a better term for it when it comes to this. When it feel in almost hypocritical in a way for, like you said, somebody to say, well, I have no control over my thoughts, but I have control over accepting that thought.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, it's you're right. It takes a lot of work to get to that place, though, and it really depends again on like certain people's traumas and that's the goal, right? That would be a wonderful thing, but it's like I said before, like given certain histories or even genetics, people will have varying degrees of difficulty in getting to that lifestyle. And I wouldn't say that even though those degrees are varying, I don't think any of them are easy for anybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so all of this then comes into play, obviously, when it comes to productivity, knowing or approaching the things that we have to do and the things that we want to do, and deciding when to do things and the why behind the things that we do, and
Yes.
how we get comfortable with, again, that middle ground of there are some things I can control, there are some things I can't control,
Mm-hmm.
or and again, the varying degree of perceptiveness on what you can or can't control,
Mm-hmm.
and how healthy you are about it. Again, not slipping into passivity and procrastination, but also the other end of it where you're micromanaging the entire world around you.
Right.
So any idea there as to how we can get better at walking that line, I guess, or deciding, again, when and when not to believe and or do when it comes to asserting control?
I think it goes back to like this idea that we all have our preferences. I think you mentioned that before. Like everybody, we need to have desires. It's impossible to not have our preferences as to how we want anything in life to work out, or life itself. So I think that the healthy medium is just this idea of, again, not having too much attachment, acknowledging the fact that, like, I would like to have this thing. I would like to make this dream come true, but also being cognizant enough and having the perspective to say, but this one thing is not what my happiness will rely on. That's where like life balance comes in, so if you're able to say, yes, this is what I would like in my life, but I can still find happiness if it doesn't come to me. Now the other, if somebody feels if they don't want to commit to something like that, they just won't have dreams at all. It'd be like, dreams don't happen, so I don't have any of them. It's like a kind of like sad and senseless defense mechanism. Obviously, like trying to stifle your own desires just so you can like avoid the pain of not having them come true is very unhealthy as well. So like there needs to be this kind of preparation for failure. There needs to be this acknowledgement that we might not have control. There needs to be this acknowledgement of chance. And it's just, it's not healthy or unhealthy. It's reality. So if we can, no, it's probably healthy. So if we can, again, like say, this is what I want, and be willing to be vulnerable like that with ourselves, but also realize that this one thing it's not who we are. Just because who we want it's not who we are. Therefore, if it doesn't come true, we don't come true. If it doesn't come true, there are other parts of my life that I can create value from. I think control is kind of putting all of your eggs in one basket in some ways. And when it comes to like the preferences of life and having a healthy relationship with them, it is, again, using all of the other things in your life that are wonderful, including your own perspective and mindset, to say that my reliance, my happiness, my self-worth does not rely entirely on any one thing.
Yeah. And it seems like that's, again, that goes back to that exercising of the one thing that you kind of can control is your reaction to what outcomes happen, regardless of how you influence them or not.
Yeah. Yeah, without question. And again, that's why you can sort of take steps, take initiative, make decisions, take ownership, like you said before, and therefore, you can do the best that you can with it. But people just have to be prepared for the fact that their best efforts can go unanswered sometimes. And being aware of that from the get-go and not having this illusion of control that, you are entirely in control of your life and its outcomes. Like if you can release that from the get-go, it's a really healthy thing, which is why a lot of I tend to have like a different stance on a lot of things than many of my other, fellow self-help workers, if you will. There's like a constant push of you can make anything you want come true. It's just like, it's not healthy. It's not healthy to not acknowledge life's ups and downs. If you can have your mindset, you can constantly work on that and sharpen that, as you alluded to. But yeah, this idea of really just putting all your eggs in one basket and believing that you have complete control over everything, certainly on the outside, is very unhealthy. At least in my opinion, and anyone who disagrees, fine.
Well, and I think here's a great landing point for this discussion is that ultimately, in the end, ownership is not necessarily asserting control. It's owning. No. It's owning that after whatever you did or did not do, you accept what happened, and then you're still in ownership of the next decision moving forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like what you said earlier at the very beginning about like ownership and responsibility, these are very different things than control. They're really healthy things. You can take ownership and responsibility over literally everything in your life, things that have absolutely nothing to do with you. But you can, if they're presented to you, like if you're just walking by a house on some evening stroll and you see a baby outside of somebody's door, like, that's something that is now in your lens, and you have to be responsible over whatever decision you make. It doesn't matter if you put the baby there. It doesn't matter if you conceive the baby. That baby's there, and it's important to take ownership over how you handle that. But again, you didn't choose for that baby to be there in the first place. Thus, you didn't have control over its presence. You have control over what you do next. And yeah, I mean that is. I think that kind of mindset creates hope for people in the future. And, a lot of people that fall into negative thinking patterns, I think, are apt to having one negative event define much more of their lives than it deserves to. But if you're able to acknowledge that I can take, this is in the past, I can take responsibility and ownership over things going forward. Like there are many more events that make up my life that also that also deserve my attention. It's in those moments that I think, in those decisions, that people are able to move on from certain things in a healthy way. So yeah, ownership and responsibility are very healthy things. And it's funny that I guess maybe it's more common when you're younger, but a lot of people sort of shy away from those things because they sound stressful. Like all of a sudden I'm responsible. I don't want this. But, the more responsibility we take over things, the better life can be because, it just comes with more presence, more, and more willingness to kind of put yourself on the line and be vulnerable and get hurt and also give. So, yeah, I mean, responsibility is an absolutely wonderful thing. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. Well, I was glad to have this conversation with you because this has turned out to almost be like a brief sit-in on a philosophy class in some ways, which is great. I love it. I love it a lot, actually. And it really does tie right into productivity. It has a lot to do with the macro level stuff, but then it drills right down into the practical level of once you have a proper perspective on this, which is going to vary from person to person, it then informs the decisions you make, like I said earlier, about what your next steps are, what you decide to be involved with, how you react or respond even. Instead of just react, you thoughtfully respond as life happens around you, and you make responsible and honoring, that's not a word, but it is now, proper ownership decisions throughout your life.
it is funny, but everything that you kind of have, everything that's happened thus far has completely vanished and is not, not something that can come back, like even just the beginning of this conversation. So, you have no choice but to start taking ownership of things going forward. And that can be hard for people, of course, but it is just the reality of things constantly moving on. The moment that you're living in right now being the only moment you'll ever know. Obviously, this is kind of repeated. People have heard it before. Mm-hmm. But it is true. And I think reminding ourselves of that and, taking certain steps to sort of live more in that mindset is a really healthy way of helping people to move past certain things because, again, the past tends to determine so much of like what we deem as a threat or whatever. But ultimately, the mindset required to break the chains of certain past events is to understand the nuance and everything and to understand that like, this thing, even though it reminds me of something terrible in the past, has its own identity, and I can approach it in a new way. I can, take ownership of it in a new way. So, yeah, I mean, all these things really, really tie together at the end of the day.
Well, if people want to continue to go down this thread or in this vein of conversation, obviously this isn't the only thing you talk about, but where would you direct them? Over to your site?
Yeah. My site is gregaudino.com, GREGAUDINO. Every video that I make and or article is about something different. There's conversations that end up being more philosophical like this, but there's also plenty of stuff on relationships. There's goal setting. There's loneliness. There's anxiety. I try to what I try to do on the website is find a new way of looking at each thing. I have videos called "The Problem with Chasing Your Dreams," "Stop Rooting Against Evil," "You Don't Want World Peace, Do You?" That's a fun one. There's a lot of stuff on there that I really enjoy writing, and I think it's pretty unique. So yeah, that would probably be the place to go for sure.
Perfect. Well, if people are busy moving through life without being able to get in front of a computer or a phone while their hands aren't free, I'll link that up in the show notes so they can find it. And Greg, Great talking with you. Great conversation. Really made me think a bit more than I thought I was going to. And that's not underestimating. That's just like, you know what? I didn't think about how deep this was going to go, drilling into, just my thought process. So thanks for making me think.
Yeah, my pleasure. Don't think too hard. It'll get you into trouble. That's what's happened to me many times.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here.
All right. Yeah, my pleasure, Eric. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your podcast listening to-do list. I hope that you found this conversation with Greg Audino calming and clarifying, like I said in the intro. And if you did, I would love it if you would do me the favor of sharing this episode with somebody that you know needs to hear it. You can do that by hitting the share button wherever you're listening to this right now. If it's on your phone, on your desktop, just hit that share button on your podcast player app of choice. Or head on over to the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next episode.